Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is a follow-up to a recent tone clip that I uploaded featuring my latest amp build, which is based on a Blackface AB763 Fender Bandmaster style circuit, including a Trainwreck modification / channel that I installed in that amp. This video, I'm going to go into detail about the circuit and the modification and what that means, and also how I put it into my amp. So first, to get started, let's get a little context here of the base AB763 circuit. Now, as a personal preference goes, this is my favorite of all of the amp circuits I've built. And one of the things that's really cool about it is that the Blackface line of amps was very versatile. And so what I'm looking at here is the Blackface Bandmaster circuit, AB763 Bandmaster. But be aware that AB63 is a very general name for a style of circuit, referring just kind of the Blackface era amps in the early 60s. And basically they almost always have the same setup in terms of the preamp and the variations in the different models. You know, there were a dozen or so different models, all the way from the Vibrachamp all the way up to the twin reverb, and they mostly occur in the power section. You know, whether you use 6V6 or 6L6 tubes, whether there's 2 or 4, solid state or tube rectifier, reverb, no reverb, head or combo, the number of speakers, some differences in things like filtering or maybe little bits in the tone stack or the B+ step down. A lot of very minor differences, but the overall effect of the amp was very, very similar across all, just because the preamp was so similar. Let's just follow this as an example, but understand that this could apply to many of the Blackface style amps. So let's kind of follow the basic structure of the vibrato channel input number 1. So we've got an input here, we've got a 1 meg resistor. This actually sets the input impedance of the amp at 1 megahertz, which is pretty important. And next we go to this connection point where we actually have a 68K resistor here, and then we also have a connection point here, assuming that input number 2 is not used, which provides another 68K. So we basically have two 68K resistors in parallel, forming about 34K of resistance. This is going to be our grid stopper or suppressor or input resistor. At about 33K, that's, I think, pretty standard. In my amps, I just use a single input, so I just use a single 33K resistor, and I think it sounds good. If you use lower values, it can help to keep things a little bit more open as far as the top end. With there's the capacitance of the tube can kind of interact with this a little bit, but if you go too low, you can actually sometimes get some high frequency oscillations or radio interference, and sometimes this is even beyond the scope of our hearing. And so I just kind of stick with this tried and true method, and it works very well for me. Then we have this on our cathode. We've got a 1.5K bias resistor and a 25 UF bypass cap. Very, very standard. 1.5K provides a very neutral center bias, and 25 UF provides a very full frequency boost. So very full output, very typical cathode setup. Onto the plate, we have a 100K plate resistor that helps provide our B+, and is what I would again consider to be very typical. After that, we move into the Blackface style tone stack. And with the tone stack, there's a whole lot of values in here that you can tweak to your personal preference. Basically, every value in here can be messed with in a way that you desire. If you want to get into that, I recommend the Duncan Tone Stack Generator. But I basically am keeping mine stack. A couple of things that I do recommend here to mess around with is on the mid-range. Now, this amp, we have a 6.8K fixed mid-range resistor, and that's fairly common for the Blackface style amps that just have treble and bass controls. They have a mid-range that is fixed at 6.8K. You can change this to a potentiometer and just use it as a variable resistor. I like to use a 25K resistor. So then, when you put that pot at about 2 or 3, you still have that classic Blackface scoop. But you can bump it up to full to get a little bit more closer to a tweed style circuit. Then you actually have this ground connection here, and what I like to do is I like to put in a lift switch, which puts a single pole double throw switch between the resistor or pot and ground. And what this does is when you send the input comes in from the resistor, and one end is connected to nothing, while the other end is connected to ground. So when it is connected to ground, the entire tone stack is active. Now the single pole double throw switch receives input from the resistor or pot, and it either sends that connection to nothing, which means that this ground does not exist, and all this filtering has no place to go, which essentially bypasses the entire tone stack. And then the other connection on the switch goes to ground, which enables it to be like in this stock form. And this has a couple of effects, which is a very, very powerful and really, really cool modification. It increases the overall gain and level tremendously, maybe 20 or 30 decibels, and it also provides a much more raw and unfiltered tonality, much more tweed-like. So those are two modifications that I really enjoy and I put on my amp, and I would highly recommend. Next, go to volume control. I don't like to use a bright switch. I just use a straight volume control. And then we have another triode stage. Again, we've got 100K on our plate, and our cathode actually goes down here and joins with this, the normal, use the same components. Now what that means is you have double the load, so this 820 ohm resistor effectively gets doubled to about 1640, so 1.6K, very similar to our 1.5K. I like to separate the cathodes and use, you know, a 1.5K 25 UF cap, just like I would over here, just as a personal preference. So next we go to a 0.1 coupling capacitor. Now you can use the larger the value you use, so like a 0.1 means you have a lot more low-end frequencies that are going to pass through. If you use a smaller value like a 0.02 or maybe even a 0.002, you're going to filter out a lot more low-end to keep things nice and tight. I like 0.02 as a personal preference, but if you follow the schematic, 0.047 or 0.1 is perfectly acceptable as well. Then we have a 220K mixing resistor, because this is the location where the normal channel and the vibrato channel are joined together, and these 220K resistors help that mixing process. And then we move into our phase inverter, and I'm not going to get into the power section right now, but just going to instead focus on the preamp, because a lot of these variables change between the different models. Alright, now I would like to switch the discussion and start talking about a Trainwreck Express style circuit. Now, a little bit of credit here. All the information that I got came from the Amp Garage, and they have a number of different posts here which are really helpful. I've never actually seen a Trainwreck in person, but this is kind of my understanding, and also just so that you're aware, there are a lot of other differences between a Trainwreck amp and a Fender amp. So, you know, even though my mod is supposed to be Trainwreck-ish, it really does not do the whole Trainwreck-ish thing. Also, Ken Fisher was kind of a genius, and he would, a lot of the time, really customize and tailor these amps. Each one had its own unique voicing. Maybe it was for the preference of the customer, or just how those specific parts worked together. You know, he'd even get into, you know, different types of capacitors. You know, for example, we've got a poly cap or a ceramic cap. You know, so he was very detailed with a lot of these things. So a number of these small component values are subject to change, but I'm focusing kind of on the macro differences between the two and how to incorporate some of these design elements into a Fender amp. So let's compare and contrast starting at the beginning. We've got a 1 meg resistor to ground that sets our input impedance exactly the same. Next, we do not have any sort of input grid stopping resistor, but I do still think one could be appropriate, and a lot of the time Ken Fisher's amps were known to run kind of on the brink or on the verge of you know, oscillation or meltdown or whatever you want to call it, and this may be a part of that. So I am not quite at the level of Ken Fisher, and so for me this is almost a safer choice to just kind of help maintain some stability, perhaps at the expense of some liveliness. But at my skill level, that's a trade-off I probably need to make. Our cathode and plate values are exactly the same. We run into a tone stack. Now some of these values might be a little different, but it's the same basic treble, bass, mid tone stack. We've got a 25K pot, and we've got a ground connection. You could do the same kind of ground lift that I talked about before. Got a volume control resistor and then another gain stage. Again, we've got a larger 220 microfarad cap, but this really doesn't make a big difference. You know, 22 UF basically is the entire frequency spectrum of a guitar. I might even argue that at like 5 UF, you know, because this basically sets the high pass passing through the cathode bypass cap, and so, you know, at 5 UF we're even at like 80 or 100 cycles per second, which is pretty low for a guitar. So 22 is really full frequency. 220 is way more than you'd ever need. A little difference here with the 2.7K bias resistor, but what I really want to focus on here is going to be this third triode gain stage. Now this is, there are some Fender amps that have a third gain stage in the preamp. For example, if we take a look at the Super Reverb, we can see that there is a third gain stage on the vibrato channel. Now with this amp you have both a tremolo and a reverb circuit on the vibrato channel, which will load down the signal quite heavily. You know, this is our reverb circuit, which is inserted right here. So this is coming out of the tone stack, out of the volume. We've got a 0.02 coupling cap, then we've got the insert for the reverb. And then we have this third gain stage right here. So it's not entirely uncommon, but in the Trainwreck, this is kind of a whole different animal. We don't have the loading of the reverb or the tremolo. So this third gain stage really makes this circuit go kind of wild. And we've got some unique design elements here. First of all, we've got some 0.001 caps that are wired in parallel. Now I just chose to use a 0.02 microfarad cap, but a smaller value would probably be really helpful to make sure you're really limiting the amount of bass frequencies that come into play. And so 0.001 would definitely do that. And also it would appear that you know, we see a 0.01 on here. I got a 0.002, a 0.002. So yeah, definitely open to interpretation. We also have a 150K resistor here to ground with this capacitor. This actually creates a high-pass filter to, again, further remove low frequencies. I've also seen some circuits where there's another resistor in play to form a voltage divider to just attenuate the signal. And actually another potential design idea here would be to introduce a straight-up volume control. And the volume control could actually help to alleviate some of the gain. You know, this amp certainly becomes a little bit of a beast. And so a volume control here could really help to attenuate some of that and keep it a little bit more under control. Not a bad idea. Now I just chose to use this stock setup. But, you know, just so be aware that this is kind of an important part of the circuit. Then we get into the chart itself. On the cathode, we just have a 10K bias resistor. Now this 10K bias resistor is very interesting. We're much higher than a 1.5K, and this is basically the cold clipper. Now what that means is it sets the bias for the tube, and at 1.5K you have a very neutral center bias. So if you've got your audio waveform, here we go. So you can see it goes up and down and up and down. When you set a very neutral bias, you've got this, think of like a center line here, and then everything above the center line is positive, everything below the center line is negative, you know, up and down, positive, negative, positive, negative. Now, when you have the 1.5K, you leave a lot of room on both the positive and negative side for the signal to swing for a lot of potentially clean headroom. With a 10K cold clipper bias, you move that line much lower. So when the signal is positive, it has a lot of room to amplify cleanly. But when it goes negative, it clips almost immediately. It has very, very little headroom to be amplified and begins clipping and distorting. And this cold clipper is used here. So that's going to have a couple of effects. First of all, it is going to be asymmetric distortion. Asymmetric meaning on our positive waveform, we have very little distortion. It's very full frequency amplification. And then on the negative end, we have a very high amount of distortion. So it's asymmetric. It's different on the positive and negative side. And what that's also going to do is create a lot of second-order harmonic distortion, which is why the amp has that very singing character, very rich harmonics going on with the amplification here. And I actually have a video on my channel. When you generate a lot of harmonics, it kind of is like when you take a single note and harmonics add different intervals of pitches on top of that note. So you almost turn every single note into a chord. That's why when you play a power chord with a lot of distortion, it sounds so full and rich, because you have all these other secondary notes almost that are being harmonized. And so second order harmonics sound very pleasing to the ear, which is a huge design feature here. And then a 100K plate resistor. No bypass cap on the cathode, which you could do a bypass cap here for even more gain. You could definitely add that on a switch if you wanted. And then we go into the phase inverter. Now on my amp, what I chose to do is, so imagine right here, when you come out of this plate of the second gain stage, in the Fender amp, come out of the plate right here, and there's actually a mixing resistor, and then we go into the phase inverter. Now the mixing resistor really is not necessary when you just have a single channel like I chose. So just imagine this coupling cap. Go back to the Trainwreck. Just imagine that we had a coupling cap, and then right here is where this is all inserted. So what I did is I come out of the plate, go into my 0.02 coupling cap, and then I go into a single pole double throw switch. Now in the up position, the signal, it bypasses all of this and goes straight here to this 0.1 UF cap, which is the phase inverter. And then in the bottom position, it sends into this cold clipping gain stage. And so that's basically what you hear in the mod, is I'm engaging this switch, engaging this third triode. And that's basically the Trainwreck mod. So what I want to do next is actually take a look at my amp itself and show you how I implemented that mod with my wiring. Alright, so now that we've gone through the differences on the schematic, I want to talk about how I implemented the circuit into my amp build. Now, this is a picture that I took of my amp kind of midway through. This doesn't have any of the Trainwreck mods. This is just stock AB763. Now, I use a point-to-point wiring setup, and you can see I mostly focus on wiring the components directly to the socket of the tubes, and then I also use, you can see some turret strips in here and along here. But with point-to-point wiring, it's actually very easy to do these kinds of modifications. Now, if you're working with something like a deluxe reverb reissue with a PCB board or something with an eyelet board, you may have to get a little creative. But to do this modification, first thing you need is a tube socket that's available to add an extra triode gain stage for a 12AX7. Now, I added mine right here, and you can see I've got my black filament heater wirings ready to go, and I also have this terminal strip, but I have no circuitry going to this tube socket and no tube. What I want you to focus on is, here's our input jack. Signal comes in and feeds into this tube, runs to the tone stack, comes back to the second part of this tube, and then we have this yellow capacitor 0.02. That is our coupling cap, which connects here, and then this sends this black wire over here to the phase inverter. And I intentionally made this set it up like this with the idea that it'd be very easy to intercept here. So we're talking about, if you look at a deluxe reverb schematic, we're coming out of this 0.02 coupling cap and then going in here. Now this one has an extra gain stage here, but basically you know, if you're looking at the normal channel, come out of the coupling cap, mixing resistor into the phase inverter. So let's take a look at this second picture that I took. This is how I actually implemented this mod into my circuit. So you can see just the yellow tip of this capacitor here, and I actually ran it into this switch. This is a single pole double throw switch. It goes to the middle connection, and how that works is in the up position, it sends the middle as the input out to this bottom lug, which goes to this black wire, which is the same one that goes, as we saw earlier, over here to the phase inverter. It's that same wire. So that's your stock AB763. But then the up position, it reroutes and sends to this red wire, which goes here to the grid of one of our 12AX7 Triode gain stages. Then I also have 10K resistor on the cathode, which you can see right there. And then I also have my 100K resistor to the plate over here. Then we also have this 150K resistor going to ground. That's also in there as well. And then it runs out of the plate here and actually connects at this same location. So basically, the signal comes in, hits this switch, either goes straight through on its way to the phase inverter, or is sent to this gain stage here, which, yeah, is basically just as the schematic is written. So yeah, with point-to-point wiring, it's pretty easy to set up. You just need to know how to read a schematic and then how to implement it into your circuit. It kind of takes a little bit of practice to figure out the techniques that work best for you. But yeah, if you guys have any other questions about this modification or how I did it, looks like my daughter wants to say hi. But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know your thoughts down below, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.